Good morning. If you've not remembered the story of Joseph or heard it before, this is a part of the story when there's a moment of forgiveness and reconnection. Joseph is the youngest of the brothers and is shown God's favor. And because of that, his brothers become jealous, and then they sell him into slavery. So he's sent off to Egypt, and then through a whole different part of the story, he rises up somehow. And because of that, and then they have this moment when the whole world is in famine, not for a year, not for a season, but for almost a decade. And he re-encounters his brothers. And in that moment, offers sort of a sense of forgiveness and love anyway, in the midst of that. And it's part of the unfolding drama of Joseph's faithfulness in the midst of the different things that sort of happened to him. This reading is paired with the gospel we have today because it's a story that relates to loving your enemy. And it's something maybe that we can hook into and maybe think about. But just for a moment, when I say, love your enemy, who is the enemy that you think of? You don't have to say out loud. This is rhetorical. But I want you to imagine that for a moment. Most of you probably picked a sibling. Just kidding. But you might have something that close in mind, right? A family member or a friend or somebody who betrayed you or some other reality. Maybe you have something larger. Maybe you have some other reality in your life that you have focused on. The interesting thing is when we kind of unpack this part of what Jesus is saying, this is the second part of the Sermon on the Mount. And so we know the more famous part, right? The Beatitudes or the, blessed are you who are this, blessed are you who are this, blessed are you who are this, woe to you who do this in this particular version. But this is the sort of practical application of what it means to live into those blessings and woes. And it is what we're called to do as disciples of Christ. And remember that in this whole little chapter 6 of Luke, Jesus is flipping the expectations of what it means to be a faithful people to up and against what everybody had known before. In other words, like in John's gospel, when we have the question, who is your neighbor? The leader comes and says to Jesus, who is your neighbor? And he defines that by telling the story of the Good Samaritan and says that it's pretty much anybody that you encounter, not just those inside. That is part of what this story is about. It isn't that you just love those that you know. It isn't that you just love those that are right or in the club. It isn't that you just love your family. It's that you love all. And it can be a deeply challenging lesson to fully embrace, and it can be difficult to even conceptualize the idea of loving your enemy. But let me talk to you about what that empowers us to do and part of what I think Jesus means for us. The words that kind of get around this, the key word that we hear is listen to those of you who listen to me. And then he says, you love your enemy. What's the word for love? It's agapete, which is it's the word that means the action of living out agape. And if you remember the word agape, Kelly and I have both kind of gone over that in different times. Agape means the kind of love that God has for us. It's not romantic love. It's not family love. It's not love that you have for food. It's not the love of, other things. It's the kind of love that is acknowledging God's light and acknowledging God's creation and God's being. And it's the kind of love that is sort of beyond our understanding and probably our capability. But then he goes on, he says, what does it mean to love? It means to love those around you. It means to do good to them, to bless them, to pray for them, and to offer from your abundance, whatever that might be, to others around you without expectation of something being returned. And part of how this is flipping it, because it might seem really counterintuitive, how can you go to someone who maybe, even as the scripture says, abused you or hurt you or did damage to you? How can you love them? How can you do good to them? How can you bless them? How can you pray for them? How can you offer something from your abundance? And that seems to be one of the most difficult things we can imagine. When I was about 12 years old, we lived in Conroe, Texas, which is just outside Houston, if you don't know that area. And my father had a very different kinds of careers. He was an attorney for a long time, and then ended up working in the oil industry. And for a while, we lived in Oklahoma City, worked for Kerr McGee, and he became sort of good at offshore leasing paperwork. So he had a really boring job. So I'll make sure you understand this was not exciting. He's not out in the oil fields working. He's sitting at a desk writing really complicated contracts and leasing arrangements. And so he was kind of an expert in that. And so he got headhunted, and we moved to Seattle to follow that. And he worked for a company that existed for about 20 months. It was started and only meant to exist for a short amount of time. And then he got headhunted again, and we ended up in Houston in the Conroe area, and he worked for another company down there. And things were going along. We lived in a community called River Plantation, which was out in between Conroe and the Woodlands. It was a country club neighborhood. And so I was young. I didn't know any different. So afternoons were often playing golf with my friends or going down to the clubhouse and ordering hamburgers and French fries. Doing stuff like that. We had, nice house. We lived in a sort of a pretty area. I got a brand new trumpet when I started playing trumpet. It was that kind of life. Things were pretty good. Dad was making decent money. Mom had an optical shop that she was running. Stuff was good for us until one day. And I remember walking into the bedroom. It was about 5 or 6 o'clock at night. I don't know where I had been. I'm sure I'd been out with my friends or something. And I came in, and I had to go back to my parents' bedroom, and my dad was sitting on the bed crying, and he had lost his job that day. He not only lost his job, but he was let go, and that was it. And then the rest of the story is this was at a time when big forces in the world were at play as to the reason why he lost that job. Saudi Arabia and the OPEC oil industry had flooded the market with massive amounts of oil. It bottomed the cost for that out, and his division, which was expensive, was suddenly gone. And he was one of 50% of the people in Houston that lost their job in that period, and the offices were emptied out. The real estate market bottomed out. There was no work for people to grab. And so that meant all kinds of financial consequences for all kinds of people, losing their homes, losing their jobs, losing their goods, and everything else like that. We would end up back in our hometown in El Dorado, and we had a family home, my great aunt's house, that was empty, and we were able to live there for a time, for a couple of years. And the first job that my dad and I had, I started working with my dad. I was 12. We started throwing papers. So as soon as I was out with school, we'd go in our little VW Bug, and we would go throw rural paper routes. That was the first job he got. The second job, he was the greenskeeper at the country club. A little bit of a juxtaposition from where we had lived to where we ended up. I was brought along with him, and I was paid cash under the table. You're not supposed to work when you're under 14, but I was allowed to work at the country club. And I was paid cash in an envelope once a week that then went to my dad to help pay the bills and other things. I was a kid, and so my mind was just caught up in all the things I was worried about, whether people liked me, all that kind of stuff. But I remember seeing these things happening and not gathering and being frustrated because my dad's direct boss at the time didn't lose his job, and my friend that was the same age, his son was still in Texas, and my friends were still in Texas, and these other things were going on, And then I didn't have a lot of love for OPEC. There was all this kind of reality. But what I don't remember is my dad turning to hate in the midst of that. He just buckled down and got after it. But then what we began to experience in that time was the love of others. It was the love of the people in the church that we went to who were kind and gentle. It was the love of others who could do what they could. It was this kind of love that came and other realities, and there was all this different stuff caught up in that sort of time and place and everything that was happening. I think about that, and I think about some of the things that we're seeing in the world today with the rapid changes that are happening for so many people. Wherever you might fall on your decisions or your understanding, that's a reality that we're experiencing. Just last week, I led a retreat for another congregation, and one of the vestry members had been a longtime employee of USAID and was waiting to get the final word on what would happen. Our daughter is caught up because funding for her PhD program has disappeared. There are other realities in the communities as you go each layer, and I'm hearing from people in the congregations, I know so-and-so who does this, or so-and-so who does that, or so-and-so who does these other things, and the pressures are on us. And then how we might approach some of the big issues within our society and what we're called to do for an immigrant or for our neighbor or for realities of race or all of this. Questions that will push against us and might upend our understanding and what we feel called to do. We might even feel powerless in the forces that are around us. That feeling of powerlessness when you can't do anything. I remember bringing my buddies home from school one day, and we sat down and Mom had made lasagna, and we ate it all. This is right after when we were living in my great aunt's house and we were still figuring things out. We ate it all. And then she says to me later, that was dinner for the next 3 nights. Of course, we were teenagers, so teenagers, if you've ever had teenagers, they like to eat. We plowed through this big plate of lasagna. And I remember that sort of pain and reality and watching my parents deal with all these things that were happening. Now as an adult, I see more of what they were dealing with than I could have seen then. But just how stressful and how difficult and how hard it was maybe to love others when all is coming at you and all is changing. Part of why I think Jesus is saying this is because that's part of the reality for the apostles as well. Who does he call to be his apostles and those who are following him? But it was the fisher people, the tax collectors, the women who found closeness to him, who followed him throughout his ministry, who were empowered. Others that were on the edges of society. And that's who Jesus called in and said, you are a child of God, and you are called to love your enemies, to love those around you, to minister to those, and to do this work, and to bring God's love and light into the darkness of the world. And that is what and where your power from God's love comes. For each of us, we're going to have different ways that we're called to be this kind of emblem of love in the world around us. How are we called to love, to do good, to bless, to pray for, to assist, and to offer? That is often, I think, the challenge, and sometimes we might feel woefully inadequate to the moment. We might not know what to do or how to handle it, or we might be having meetings and conversations about realities and understandings at our work. We might not be sure all of these things happening will affect all of us in some way eventually. And so then what do we do about that? What do we do if we encounter an immigrant, a person that we might consider our enemy? Not that those two things are the same, by the way. What do we do when we encounter someone that might have made decisions or has power to make decisions? What do we do when we see policies and realities unfolding that we don't agree with or understand or think are wrong? Jesus doesn't say, be silent. Jesus doesn't say, oh, just go back to your house and don't worry about it. Jesus doesn't say, take a step back and take the easy path. He doesn't say, just go to the people that you know that you're going to be okay with. He doesn't say, just buckle. He says, love in a way that God would love. That is power to do something that is beyond our understanding and strength at times. We can look through our history and our knowing and people who've lived out their faith, who've been willing to take that kind of risk in everyday life or in bigger ways. So I want to challenge you to sort of take some time to pray about this and to think about your call to live into those things. Who is it in your world that God has called you to love, to do good, to bless, to pray for, to assist, and to offer, right? When it's seemed difficult to do that. But to understand that part of it is not to see them for their brokenness or their frailty or where they are or the wrongs that they do, but instead to see God's light, even if it's the faintest possible light you can see, and to respond to that. And to know that in the long arc of justice, that God's reign of love is what's empowered. You know, it was funny. I've told this story before, but I remember in that time when I was working at the country club, when I was a freshman in high school, I got invited to go out and do leadership stuff, and I got to go meet the president of the junior college, right? And that was a big deal in my town. I thought, this is big. And we had to wear a tie, which meant I had a clip on, right? And I had to wear nicer shoes to school, which I had. I had Sunday shoes, which we only wore on Sundays. It never fit me, but I had them that day. And I went, and me and a couple other people that were a couple of the girls in my class, a couple of guys in class, we were sort of chosen by our teacher to go, and we got to go and sit and have lunch with the president of the junior college and to have conversations about leadership and all that kind of stuff. And we had this great conversation. And then later that day, I would see the same man at the country club, but I was wearing country club clothes to mow. I'd been weed eating and mowing. I was filthy. I had stuff all over me. I'd been digging. I'd been doing all the work, and he couldn't see me. I said, hey, Mr. So-and-so, and he just walked right by as if I didn't exist. And I got an inkling, just an inkling of what tons of people experience in their life every day when we can't see people because of some reason that's in our frailty. And the danger is if that kind of stuff becomes the norm and we don't see the humanity around us or understand empathy or understand the connection that we have with every person and every decision that's made, or we don't see the reality of the people that are being affected are all children of God. There are no people that are not children of God and are not our co-equals in God's relationship that we have with God. If we're afraid of that, then we've missed the part of the gospel that we're hearing for today. So take some time to think about what you're called in the midst of all of the world that we're in. And this is a call that exists every day of our life, not just in this moment. But what does it mean to live this particular part of the gospel out? To be that disciple in small ways or large ways. But to bring light and life and God's love into every place that you are, even sometimes at risk. Amen.